Mr. Bone. I'm grateful, I'm sure we're all very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for Cumberland Valley for securing this debate, but also to all other Honourable and Right Honourable members for their contributions. And I shall try, in the course of slightly longer time, to respond to all the points raised. As the Honourable Lady said, and indeed it was reiterated by my Right Honourable friend for Sutton Coldfield, this year marks the 70th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, which were designed after the terror and the horror of the Second World War to serve as a founding pillar of what we know today as international humanitarian law. They represent a clear affirmation that the principles of international humanitarian law are both neutral and universally recognised. So today's motion, I think, highlights the central place of IHL in international efforts to protect civilians who are affected by conflict in our world today. There is little doubt that as conflicts become increasingly complex, IHL will become ever more important, and indeed as a body of law will expand. The underlying principles, the distinctions between civilians, those ordre de combat, the combatants, the principle of necessity and the prohibition on the infliction of unnecessary suffering, the principle of proportionality, the observance of precautions in attack, and the principle of humanity. These are all clear and unambiguous. But, of course, as many speakers today have rightly pointed out, the nature of conflict is changing. Too often in practice, the distinction between combatants and civilians, between a legitimate target and one that is not, have become blurred. Too often civilians, including, of course, aid workers, are deliberately targeted. And in almost all modern wars, it's not the combatants who suffer most, but the civilians. Indeed, current patterns of violence conflict worldwide show, I think this was brought up by a number of members, that some 90% of all casualties today are civilian. As urbanisation increases, the International Committee of the Red Cross has reported that there are some 50 million people worldwide affected by armed conflict in cities. The changing nature of conflict also presents challenges for states such as the United Kingdom and our allies, who seek to provide humanitarian assistance and to make a positive contribution to preserving international peace and security, and to ending conflict, including, where necessary, through military action. They are challenges that the UK government is committed to facing because we all take our commitments to international humanitarian law and to the protection of civilians in our operations and in the humanitarian contexts where we provide assistance very seriously. We consider adherence to IHL to be a paramount consideration in all of our approach to conflict. And when we encounter potential violations, we are strongly supporting the engagement of appropriate mechanisms to deal with them, whilst ensuring that we have a domestic legal framework that ensures that our armed forces are fully accountable. The UK military, and I think a number of members will recognise that obviously the MOD has an important part to play in this, and some of the aspects of the questions that I'll come on to in a moment or two really do relate to that government department. But the UK military is at pains to operate at the highest standards. It closely monitors and verifies the impact of our military activity. And I think my right honourable friend for Sutton Coldfield rightly pointed out that the increased use of social media both provides a mechanism for long-term maintenance of evidence, but also on a very day-to-day basis, a recognition where military or other individuals have surpassed what is acceptable. The protection of civilians is and will remain a central pillar of the UK's approach to our humanitarian efforts and to managing conflict. And it's been pointed out, in the UN Security Council, we have played a leading role over some 20 years in developing that international approach. Might I say, actually, in response to what my honourable friend for Henley said earlier on, South Africa, currently the African nation on the Security Council, Tunisia will join. I think, I very much hope they will play an important part in this, given the recent conflicts that have taken place there. But he will also perhaps be aware that the Asian nations that are currently on the Security Council, Indonesia and indeed Vietnam, have made issues around peacekeeping, the rights of combatants and civilians in war, an important part of what they would hope to achieve. And I hope we will work together with those countries and indeed others within the UN Security Council to raise the profile of many of these issues during the course of the next 2 years and indeed beyond. So to coincide with the 20th anniversary of the first resolution on this issue, we are undertaking a review of our approach to the protection of civilians in armed conflict. really to ensure that it is fit for purpose in the context of modern conflict and that it addresses all civilians, including children and other particularly vulnerable people. And that goes to the heart of the point made by the honourable gentleman for East Dunbartonshire. Yes, we do. Westminster. Yes, he might well become the leader of the Liberal Democrat Party while we speak as well. If I'm not careful, we make that mistake. I think he has a supporter directly behind his left shoulder there, I think. He makes a very good point, which is a recognition that there are issues around disability, around children, others, and we don't just simply look upon civilians as a single group. I think part of what we're trying to achieve here is very much focused on what I think is very much a public demand about all of these matters. Our approach to the review I think embraces a cross-Whitehall consultation, as proposed by the Right Honourable Lady, as well as consultations fundamentally with all aspects of civil society. And we've made reference, obviously, to the Save the Children, but there are a number of other charities who are going to play an important part in this review. When completed, we hope it will contain an agreed government-wide position that will take account of all of the government departments. And to demonstrate what this means in practice, I'd like to focus on three main areas: our international engagement, our work on international peacekeeping, and our domestic activity to promote and to uphold international humanitarian law. On that international stage, our permanent seat on the Security Council, of course, bestows upon us, as has been pointed out by a number of members, an important responsibility to protect civilians and uphold IHL whenever and wherever international peace and security is under threat. We haven't shied away from those responsibilities, of course.
I thank him for giving way. And as part of this review, is he aware that the World Bank has changed from a system of trying to put out today's fires, as it were, to a system whereby they are trying to identify the fires that are going to occur tomorrow and for stopping them becoming fires? And should we not adopt something similar for the UN?
Yes, to an extent I agree. I mean, obviously predictions for the future are always fraught with difficulty. I mean, a number of the conflicts that I'm going to touch on now might have been predictable 10 or 15 years ago, but others have come unexpectedly. So we need to have a flexible system, but I think there is some sense with having that forward-looking approach at the UN as well as at the World Bank. In Iraq, the UK, I think, has been at the forefront of efforts to ensure accountability for the crimes committed by Daesh, or the so-called Islamic State. Through a Security Council resolution adopted in 2017, we helped to establish a UN investigative team to support the Iraqi government in the collection, the preservation and the storage of evidence linked to Daesh crimes. On Syria, as my right honourable friend pointed out, we co-sponsored the UN General Assembly resolution in December of 2016 that established the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism for Syria, designed to deliver accountability for horrific atrocities, including the deliberate targeting of civilians and the use of chemical weapons. And in Burma or Myanmar, it was the UK as the penholder at the UNSC that co-sponsored the creation of the UN fact-finding mission, which concluded that ethnic cleansing had been carried out against the Rohingya by the Myanmar military and could amount to genocide. We then worked in the UN Human Rights Council to establish a unique investigative mechanism to collect and preserve evidence of atrocities for future prosecutions, recognising, which I'm afraid is tragic in certain cases, is that we know that those who need to be brought to account will remain in office possibly for many years still to come, but nonetheless having a reliable and legally watertight mechanism to hold them to account. I would like to think that our country has played a leadership role, and of course we don't do this alone, we do it with like-minded partners in addressing other conflict situations, such as in Sudan, in Yemen, in Libya, and the Horn of Africa. Let me, if I may, come on to talk a little bit about some of the contributions that have been made. I think risks around serious violations of international humanitarian law or major violations or abuse of human rights are a key part of our assessment against that consolidation criteria under the IHL. A licence will not be issued in relation to arms export for any country, if so to do, would be inconsistent with any provision of the mandatory criteria, including where we assess where there is a clear risk that it might be used in the commission of a serious violation of IHL. The situation is kept under careful and continual review, and we examine every application rigorously on a case-by-case basis. Of course, this applies in Yemen and with Saudi Arabia, but in many other walks as well. This is designed to be, if I may just a forward-looking test. A license will not be issued to Saudi Arabia or any other destination if to do so would be inconsistent with any provision of the consolidated EU or national arms export licensing criteria.
I'm grateful for that. I just wanted to intervene on arms exports. Unless there is proper end-use monitoring, and we do not do proper end-use monitoring, we can't be confident in the assertions the honourable gentleman was making.
I was actually going to come on to that very point, because I knew it was the point that the right honourable lady had made earlier on. Of course, okay.
Andrew Mitchell. Just while he's collecting points to come on to. Does he agree with me that it's not a good idea for investigations into breaches of international humanitarian law to be undertaken by one of the parties to the conflict, namely Saudi Arabia? Isn't it better to agree that under UN auspices, any such inquiries should be neutral? Otherwise, it's akin to a student marking their own homework.
I wish I had homework that I could mark these days. It's more my children's I have to do that. But he makes a very valid point. I mean, I think, actually, above all, the issues even less to do with the whether that is desirable, it's for the credibility in the international community of such outcomes. So I think he makes a fair point. If I may return to the Right Honourable Lady. On the operational end-use monitoring and the establishment of a dedicated civilian casualty mitigation and investigation team, as she's pointed out. This is, of course, an MOD lead, but I will ensure that this speech is passed on to my friends over in that department, and I'm sure they're well aware of the concerns that are going to be raised here today. Naturally, it relates to operations in the field and therefore is an MOD matter. But from our side, I think we do believe that we are trying to improve this whole issue of data collection, as I've referred to in other parts of the world, and feel that may have an important part to play. There is apparently a project that is underway with the University of Manchester looking at many of these related issues, and I hope that the Right Honourable Lady will be able to feed in to that in part. The Honourable Gentleman for East Londonderry is no longer in his place, but he did make a point about child soldiers. The UK is firmly committed to ending the recruitment and the use of child soldiers and to the prohibition of all children affected by armed conflict. We are an active member of the United Nations Working Group on Children in Armed Conflict, and I also believe this is going to be an important part, as I say, of the Indonesian presidency next year, that they want to address this terrible issue. My honourable friend for Henley talked on Africa, and I've discussed a little bit about the Security Council issues. May I also just say this? Uganda, Senegal and Ghana, I'm not sure that they were all in his hit list, and I've put them in reverse alphabetical order there, but they are working with the US and other countries, looking, I think, to have a positive reform on the ICC. And obviously, we very much would like to see more activity within Africa, given, as he rightly points out, the prevalence of concerns that have arisen from that part of the world. The Right Honourable Gentleman for Carshalton and Wallington, and I think the drones issue is an extremely important issue. There's an important issue of legality on drones, and the implications of the German High Court ruling in relation to the support. Again, it's an MOD lead. We will look very closely at the German High Court ruling, but upholding IHL is already integral, I think, to any assistance that we would provide to other states. But this is a matter, as I say, that is under review at the moment through the MOD, of course.
Just on that point, I know I and possibly other members who are here today would like perhaps something in writing from the Minister once those discussions have been completed.
I'm very happy to undertake to do that. Can I just say a little bit also about the challenges that our UN peacekeeping face? In today's modern conflicts, missions are facing increasingly asymmetric and physical threats and can be targets, of course, themselves. And the importance of finding political solutions remains paramount. We are very much committed to improvements in peacekeeping, and we will continue to call to support improvements in what we call the 3 Ps of peacekeeping, in planning, pledges and performance, as we set out in a communique along with 63 nations at the London 2016 UN Peacekeeping Defence Ministerial meeting. If I may, because I realise that time is getting a little bit tight, and if there are matters that I haven't been able to bring up, I will try and do so in writing, and I will make sure my team look through the Hansard transcript. Let me just say, as I say, that there is a key approach is that there should be no impunity. Primary responsibility for investigation and prosecution of the most serious international crimes rests, of course, with the states themselves. But where those states are unwilling or unable to fulfil those responsibilities, other justice mechanisms, such as the International Criminal Court, have an important role to play. The UK remains one of the foremost contributors to the ICC, and we shall work to ensure that the court undergoes the necessary reforms to enable it to fulfil the mandate as the court of last resort, as intended under the Rome Statute. Similarly, we have been strong advocates of ad hoc and hybrid international tribunals, such as the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and its successor, as well as the Special Tribunal for Lebanon and the residual Special Court for Sierra Leone. UN peacekeeping, as I've said, is such an important aspect of the protection of civilians, and we will continue to work together with the international community on this. In addition to our international efforts, we're also working domestically to ensure that we can do all we can to uphold IHL in the interest of protecting civilians. We've established a Centre of Excellence for Human Security, which will deliver extended training on the protection of civilians, as well as for women, peace and security, against human trafficking and sexual exploitation, and cultural property protection. Ours is the first military in the world to have a dedicated national defence policy on human security, and this centre, I think, will help other militaries. We've also had a Safe Schools Declaration to support the continuation of education during armed conflict, and the publication of our own voluntary report on the implementation of international humanitarian law at a domestic level. Mr. Bone, I appreciate you want to ensure the Right Honourable Lady gets a minute in at the end, but if I may just conclude by saying this. Our support, recognised, I think, by everyone in the House, for the principles, rules and instruments of international humanitarian law remains unwavering. The robust framework, I think, is designed to protect with civilians in mind. We take our responsibilities very seriously, and I'm glad that the House feels as strongly as we do. This review is underway. I'm convinced it will be a great success, and not least because it will have input from members here, but of course from a range of other bodies with these interests close at heart. And I very much hope that we can discuss these matters again in the House before too long.